What if events went differently? What if Peter Parker did not give up being Spider-Man in Spider-Man 2? What if he chose a different path, a path of responsibility? Find out in today's fan fiction. Before we get into the video, I do want to give a big shout out to @Tanner_ on Instagram. Do make sure to follow him because he made this amazing thumbnail, so all of the credit goes to him. I'm very, very thankful for it. He didn't even have to do this. He's a talented artist, and I highly suggest you guys to check out his work and follow all of his social medias. But anyways, let's get into the fan fiction. Events in the Spider-Man 2 timeline would be playing out the same, and Peter would be sitting with Uncle Ben in the car. He would tell Uncle Ben that he wanted a life of his own and that he was only Peter Parker, until in this timeline, something would spark in Peter's head, remembering everything that happened with Green Goblin and how he saved the children and MJ. Uncle Ben would tell Peter that the city needed a hero and that he was the only hero that could protect the people that he cared about and the people that he loved. Uncle Ben would tell Pete that it wasn't too late to turn back and become that hero once again. He would tell him with great power there must also come great responsibility, and Peter would remember all of the people that he saved, and everything would be flashing in his head and the power that he truly had within himself. And Uncle Ben would tell Peter that one last time to take his hand, and he would put all of his trust into him and Aunt May, and Peter would look at his hand and he would take it, and Uncle Ben and Peter would shake hands. He would tell Uncle Ben that he was just Spider-Man and that he was no longer Peter Parker. Not anymore. Uncle Ben would smile, and Peter would look at his hand to see the changes, the confidence he was regaining in himself. He would crawl on top of the ceiling and he would smile, looking at his two hands. He would shoot a web and it would hit the wall, and he would smile, seeing that he had regained all of his powers back, and he would tell himself he wasn't going to fail Uncle Ben, not again. And he would look at his red and blue Spider-Man suit and he would put it on. He would swing through New York City, feeling a rush of purpose and happiness in his life once again. Peter would take his old Peter Parker clothes and he would throw them into the garbage, and he would walk away in the rain with his Spider-Man suit. This would change the timeline big time. Peter would stop going to most of his classes during the day because of how busy he was being Spider-Man, and he would work more at the Daily Bugle, getting more pictures to sell to J. Jonah Jameson to get extra money. Peter would have a bit more downtime to himself because of how many people he would stop in one day. Criminals would be afraid of Spider-Man because Spider-Man would be stopping these criminals before harm could be done, and MJ would still have her play during this timeline, and Peter would be building up a lot of confidence within himself, knowing that he could still potentially get with MJ, and he thought, what did he have to lose? He would give it one more shot. And Peter would go to the play not having any issues getting there in this timeline, and the timeline would be similar, and MJ and Peter would catch up during the play, and just like our original timeline, MJ would tell Peter she was getting married to John and that it was too late for him. She would tell Peter she had to leave, but Peter would grab her arm, saying he had more to say, and Peter would tell her to come with him into this alleyway. She would tell Peter that she was getting scared, but Peter would say not to worry, and he would jump onto the wall crawling. MJ would be shocked, and she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Peter would go on, saying that this was the real reason they couldn't be together, and that he had enemies, and that if they were together, that they might be hunted down, or she would be put into harm's way, just like what Green Goblin did. Peter would go on, saying that it was okay if she didn't want to be together with him, but he had to make her understand what was really going on. He would say it was his responsibility to keep the city safe and her with it. Peter would tell her that this was his new job now, and that he can still have a life of his own, but it would be responsibility that would come first. She would cry, telling Peter to wait, but Peter would crawl up the wall after hearing police sirens, and he would leave her standing in the alleyway. She would see him swing as Spider-Man leaving. She would cry, knowing what she truly wanted. Spider-Man was on the top, better than ever. Spider-Man would be fighting criminals and would stop a heist at the Daily Bugle, saving J. Jonah Jameson in front of everybody that worked there. J. Jonah Jameson would be embarrassed, yelling at Spider-Man, saying that he should have quit and left the city by now, and Spider-Man would have enough of this, calling him out. He would yell at him, saying that without Spider-Man there wouldn't be anybody to save him or the company. Spider-Man would use his webs to smash a Daily Bugle newspaper sign, and the glass would go everywhere right near his feet. He would tell him to start changing his ways and stop feeding the people of the city garbage, and then he would leave the building swinging going to Aunt May's house. The confidence within Peter was getting higher and higher as each hour of the day passed. He felt at peace with himself and Uncle Ben, and he knew that he was making Uncle Ben proud. Peter knew he had one more thing to do, and that it was to tell Aunt May everything that happened with him, and that he wanted to finish this once and for all. Just like our original timeline, Peter would be talking with Aunt May at the cemetery, and they would go back to Aunt May's house, and Peter would explain more of the story, going deep into his origin story, saying that he was bit by a spider and that he could have stopped the robber that tried to kill Uncle Ben, but he didn't. He would tell Aunt May that it was his fault for what happened, but he was been given a gift to become Spider-Man. Aunt May would faint on the ground because of this, and Peter's spider sense would go off in time, and he knew that, even if she hated him, he had to get the truth out there. He would put her on the chair, and he would leave to go to Harry's house to end the pain once and for all that Spider-Man has caused everyone. He knew that he had to redeem himself if he was going to put this mask on full time. Spider-Man would swing to Harry's, but would hear talking in the background. He would crawl onto the other side of the wall, and down below near the streetlights, Bernard, just about to leave for the night, would see Spider-Man on the wall, and he knew that he had to go back into the building because he thought something was up. Spider-Man was hearing Harry and Otto, and he knew something wasn't good. Otto was back. He could hear Otto telling Harry he wanted the tritium, and Harry would tell him to bring Spider-Man alive to him and that he could have the tritium for free. Peter knew that he either had to follow Otto or talk to Harry. Spider-Man would make the right choice, and he would trail Otto, going to the waterfront dock where the experiments all started. Peter knew that he wasn't going to act stupid and rush off. He had to think of a plan to outsmart Otto, and he knew that he wanted the tritium, but the only way that he could get the tritium was to find Spider-Man. Spider-Man would go further into the broken down waterfront docks, and he would see machines being worked on, and he knew that this was the place where the energy reactor blew up, and he would leave silently, and he would swing back to Harry's place. Harry would be sitting on the couch looking at the safe that had the tritium. A voice would echo in the room, and Harry would look to see Spider-Man. Harry would be shocked, and he would run to grab a knife, but Spider-Man would use his webs to get it out of his hands before Harry could even use it. Harry would charge at Spider-Man, but Spider-Man would dodge each attack and tell Harry to stop, and he would kick him to the ground, saying that he listened in on the conversation and he knows what's about to go down. He would ask Harry for the tritium, but Harry would say that he wasn't going to give him anything until he confesses for murdering his father. Spider-Man would use his webs to tie Harry up, and he would explain to him on the couch what actually happened here that day. And he would explain that Norman tried to use the glider to try to kill him, but he moved out of the way and it ended up killing himself. Harry would yell, saying that it was a lie, until a voice out of the room would say it was true. It was Harry's butler, and he would walk out of the shadows, and he would tell Harry that Spider-Man was telling the truth and that he didn't want to tell him until the time was right, but he knew he was blaming the wrong person, and Bernard knew that Harry had to let go of his vengeance against Spider-Man and finally put things to rest. And Bernard would ask Spider-Man to let Harry go, and he would rip the webs off of him, and Bernard would tell Harry to come see, and Harry would end up getting off of the couch, and all three of them would look at a mirror, and Bernard would press a button, and there would be a secret compartment, and a door would open, and it would open to the Goblin's hangar. It had gliders, pumpkin bombs, everything. Harry would fall to the ground crying, knowing it was true, and he would feel a sense of relief and loss on his shoulders. Spider-Man would help Harry get to his feet, and he would tell Harry to listen to Bernard, and he would shake his head walking towards the couch, and he couldn't even believe it. Spider-Man would tell Bernard that things were starting to get unsafe here, and he told him that he should leave just in case anything would happen, and Harry would look in shock, learning the truth about what just happened and what was going to come next. Harry would tell Spider-Man that they needed to destroy all of the equipment before it could get into the wrong hands. Spider-Man would explain that that's the least of their worries right now, and he would take his mask off, saying that he was sorry. Harry would be in shock and yell at Peter, and Peter would drop his mask on the ground, explaining he wanted to tell him everything, but he didn't know when the time was right, and he thought the time was now. Peter would have tears in his eyes, saying that he was truly sorry about his dad, that it was either him or MJ that was going to die that night. Harry would shake his hand, saying that he forgave Peter for everything that happened, and Peter would smile, knowing the right thing was done. Harry would rush to get the tritium, and Peter would take it, and he would look at the tritium, and he would smash it onto the ground. It was now useless. The timeline has been forever changed. The fight between Doc Ock and Spider-Man on the train and for the tritium doesn't happen in this timeline. Harry doesn't die in Spider-Man 3 or become evil, because now he knows the full truth of Spider-Man and his father. And Otto would live in this timeline, or maybe not. Peter would tell Harry that he was going to go after Otto to destroy his machine and put him in prison once and for all. Harry would tell Peter to be careful, and he would leave the house swinging to the dock. He would see Otto working on the other parts of the machine, and he would crawl into the area looking at where he was going to attack Otto. He would throw the broken tritium on the ground, and it would roll near Otto, and Otto would be confused, and he would hear a noise, and he would look what it actually was, and it was the destroyed tritium, and he would hear an echo in the room saying that his plan has come to an end and that he wouldn't let him destroy the city once again. Doc Ock couldn't believe his eyes. The tritium was destroyed, all of his work was for nothing, and Spider-Man was still alive out in the open. Spider-Man's voice would still echo around in the room, saying that if he wanted to talk about things properly, Doc Ock would tell him that he had a new plan in mind now, and that he was going to kill him and get rid of the bug once and for all, and he was also going to kill that pesky Harry Osborn for this. Spider-Man's voice would be heard again, echoing, saying it was his arms that were controlling him and that he didn't want to fight him. Spider-Man would be using his webs to knock the machine over to throw it into the water, and he would use his webs to make a circle around it, and he would pull on it and jump out of the way in time, destroying the machine. It would go into the water, and Spider-Man from behind would kick Doc Ock in the head, and he would fall into the water. He would be electrocuted in the water, and his arms would be severely damaged. Spider-Man would kick Otto in the back, but one of his arms would catch him and choke him in the air, throwing Spider-Man in a wall, and the pillar would crack, breaking open. Doc Ock would use the rest of his strength to get back up, and he would fight Spider-Man. Ock would charge his arms at Spider-Man, and he would be hit into the wall, and he would fall onto the pillar, and the pillar would break, collapsing that area, and Spider-Man would fall into the water. The weight was super heavy, and Spider-Man was trapped under the water trying to break free, and his hand would reach the surface, and Spider-Man was trying the best that he could. He was fading away, and he was fading fast. Otto would stare at Spider-Man. He knew, is this how he wanted to finish Spider-Man off? No, he didn't want to finish him like this. He wanted to finish him like a man, and he would take his arm, and he would lift Spider-Man up, but Spider-Man would kick him in the face, and Spider-Man would fall to the ground. Spider-Man would crawl back up, and Otto would look to see Spider-Man. His mask was completely torn all the way down, and he could see that it was Peter Parker. Peter would tell Ock to give up. Otto would use his arms to grab his neck, and he would say it was his life's work. Peter would explain to Otto that it was the arms that were controlling him, and that there wasn't much time before the sea level would rise, and that they could almost drown if they don't get out of here fast enough. There wasn't a lot of time left. Peter was begging with Otto, and Otto would tell Peter that he was always trying to play the hero, and that it would be his downfall, and Peter would tell Otto that it was his responsibility to do it, and that sometimes we have to give up the things for the greater good, and Peter would tell Otto he had the power to do it. He would let him go, and he would look at his hands, and Otto would drop to the ground. A massive wave from the sea would come in, and it would crash at the shore, crashing into the dock, and all of the glass and the metal sheets would fall onto Spider-Man and Doc Ock. They would be underwater, and the metal would come crashing down onto Spider-Man and Ock, and they were both pinned to the ground, and they were drowning. He was trapped, and he could see that the metal was destroying Ock's arms in the water, and that he was pinned between two metal sheets in the water. They were drowning slowly. Spider-Man would try to break free from the metal, and he would see Otto was dying slowly. Spider-Man would look within himself to find the strength, and he would lift up the metal sheets, screaming underwater, and he would rush towards Ock, and he would rip apart of the metal sheets with his bare hands, yelling and screaming in the water. There would be blood everywhere, and they would swim to shore. The ambulance, police, and fire would be awaiting them, and they would see Ock come to shore, and his metal arms were completely destroyed. They would revive him, and Otto would look in the distance to see Peter looking at him, and Otto would smile. The cops would arrest him, and he would be thrown in prison. Peter would be back at Aunt May's house, saying she was proud of Peter for telling her everything, and she would tell him Uncle Ben would be proud of him, and she would tell Peter to never give up being Spider-Man and to always try to be the best of himself. MJ would see this in her window, and she would smile. Peter would go to the Osborn residence house, and Harry would be happy to see Peter, and they would shake hands, and Peter would see movers, and Harry would explain to Peter he was moving away from the house and going into something more smaller, something that was going to be more comfortable for him. Peter would be happy, and they would destroy all of the equipment left from the Goblin, and Harry would tell Peter he had his back every step of the way as Spider-Man. Peter would leave the house doing one final swing, and that's where we're going to end. What if Peter Parker didn't give up being Spider-Man? So this was an amazing fan fiction. I do want to give a big thank you to all of the people that requested me to do this one, because this was like completely crazy. Like, I didn't know really where I wanted to take the story, but I thought we would take it into a different direction where Spider-Man would live in the end of the story. So I'm very happy with the turnout, and do make sure to request your fan fictions in the comments down below. And if you guys did enjoy this video, do make sure to subscribe, like, share, and turn your notifications on so you and your friends are up to date with the latest content. But anyways, as always, guys, peace out.